Today's episode on expressiveness is a little bit of a challenge because it forces us to mess around with a vital parameter, the clock. If you remember, in the previous episode we talked about how to add some emphasis to certain notes by playing them louder. This technique can be included in the group of dynamic accents because they have to do with amplitude changes. However, there is another group of accents called agogic accents, and they have to do with tempo. Agogic derives from the Greek verb ago, which means to lead or to carry, and as a matter of fact, in ancient Greek music treatises, agoge meant the tempo. An agogic accent is thus a kind of emphasis that we obtain by pulling the melody back to create a sense of anticipation or pushing it forward to create a sense of rush. We gently touched the whole agogic topic in the first episode of this series, the one about articulation, but if you remember, back then we just played with the space between the notes and we never actually changed the tempo or the pulse. So this time is different because we actually have to make our melodies faster or slower. As always, we will reference mainly to Western notation symbols because that is what we are mainly used to. But if you are familiar with other musical traditions, let me know in the comments below. The first symbol that we want to take a look at is the fermata, which in Italian means stop or halt. We place it above or below a note or a pause, and it means that such a note or pause should be held longer than its nominal duration. There are some indications as for how long this note should be held, but it is generally up to the performer or the composer. Okay, so the patch is pretty straightforward. CVA controlling the Brenso, gate controlling Falistri's envelope, controlling the final amplitude. Sapel is clocking the Usta. The sequence is pretty straightforward, 16 stages, one time unit each. We just played a little bit with the gate length as we did in the articulation video in the previous episode of this series. So if we want to add a fermata, for example, to make our sequence stay longer on this note, my suggestion is to use a CVB, but we must set CVB to output negative voltages. So for this purpose, we're gonna enter the track menu, select the CVB range, and set it to plus and minus 5 volts instead of 0, 10. Now, since all the stages are off, every stage will output a minus 5 volts, which is quite too much, so we need to hold down set all and the chorus button to bring them to 0 volt, which is halfway through. And we are going to patch our CVB output to the clock modulation input and make sure to set this switch to the right, otherwise it will act as a manual gate for the sample and all. Anyway, now we just need to reduce the voltage of this specific stage. And if we have some pauses in the sequence, like in this case, we can make the same trick but on pauses. So we can set the CVB of the stage without gate, which are our pauses, since the stage length is always here, and we can play with this one to create a fermata. Of course, we could have achieved the same result by increasing the stage length. But see, I don't like this operation particularly because it scrambles my pattern, and if I played with multiple patterns and I wanted to add a fermata across all the tracks, I think I would still have used the CVB technique, especially considering that if I want to remove this fermata, I can simply remove the clock modulation. So this is a less destructive operation. The two other symbols aren't strictly symbols, but rather performance indications, Ritardando and Accelerando, which mean respectively delaying and accelerating. When we see these indications, we know that we must slow down our tempo or speed it up. Let's see how to achieve it in our modular setup. So the patch is the same as before, and to create a sort of accelerando across the pattern, we can simply use our Shift All button so that all the follow, or even the set all button would do in this case, since all the stages have the same value, and gently rotate all the stages. So you can hear that the sequence is starting slow and getting faster. And we can even add longer gates towards the end to make it rush even more. And perhaps shorter at the beginning. And for the rallentando, it's basically the same. So let's go back to 0 and reduce. The set all and the shift all button when we want to have a sort of a scale of values across the stages are the essential tool, and they speed up the editing process in an incredible way. The final Agogic indication that we want to talk about today is the Rubato. It literally means stolen, and it can be seen as a special kind of Ritardando and Accelerando. So instead of a dramatic tempo change, with Rubato we are somehow taking a small portion of our melody and moving it back or forth without changing the overall pulse. So we are kind of stealing some tempo that we are promptly giving back. So to achieve a rubato effect, which implies stealing some timing but then giving it back, so we are not going to modulate the clock because otherwise we will end up changing also the bass. So what we're gonna do is playing with the phase. So we're gonna use the phase shift function of the sequencer and slightly change the phase of the first track in relation to the second one, and then we're gonna give it back. So we are going to cross patch the CVB output of our track 1, which at the moment is set to 0 volt, back to the CVA or B input, it really doesn't matter. And I have set the CVB to unipolar because this CV input is unipolar, and then we are assigning it to phase shift. So CVA is controlling the phase shift. Now let's say that we want to gradually steal some time from the end of this sequence, and then we are simply adding some voltages here. See? Or we can add a more gradual increment, like starting from here and arrive at a higher value right here, let's say. And then going promptly back to 0. And you can really hear that we are kind of stealing some energy, but then we're gonna give it back right here. Most of us may play genres where a steady clock is the foundation and it is non-negotiable, so these techniques might hardly prove useful on a daily basis. However, knowing that the clock itself can be a modulation target, I think it is a valuable tool to have in our kit. We don't have to use it all the time, but it is good to know that it is there in case we need it. Next video we will talk about ornaments, so stay in touch. I hope you found this one useful, and I will see you next time.